Tonight, the boundaries between present and past dissolve like ancient smoke over Mediterranean waters. Feel the air heavy with sea salt and the ghost of burned papyrus, where Alexandria once gleamed as the intellectual jewel of the ancient world. If this journey touches your soul, join us again and whisper from where you listen to us. Now, dim the lights. Breathe deeply. Let us dream with memories that are not our own. I walk across stones still warm from what was once the great port of Alexandria, where the tallest lighthouse in the ancient world guided ships laden with knowledge. The year is 48 before Christ, and the air vibrates with tension, not just from Mediterranean heat, but from the civil war tearing at the heart of the Roman world. Here, where Ptolemy I once dreamed of gathering all human knowledge under one roof, now echoes the sound of swords and the crackling of unintended flames. I touch the stones of the wharf and feel history pulsing through them. These same stones witnessed the arrival of Julius Caesar, pursuing Pompey across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. But Caesar did not come as a conqueror of wisdom. He came as a desperate man, cornered by an Egyptian fleet that threatened to cut off his only escape route. What happened in those March days would forever change the fate of the greatest library in the ancient world. The night wind carries whispers of ancient scribes, their voices mingling with the sound of waves. They tell me that the truth about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria is not a simple story of villains and heroes, but a complex tale of multiple deaths, each more subtle than the last. The first wound was accidental, an act of military desperation that transformed into intellectual tragedy. I imagine Caesar in that fateful moment, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the terrible irony of fate. He who admired Greek culture and respected learning was about to become the first of many to mortally wound the intellectual heart of the ancient world. The flames he ordered to burn the Egyptian ships knew no boundaries. They leapt from water to land, from ships to warehouses, from warehouses to the first papyrus scrolls. The moon reflects in the calm waters of the modern harbor, but my eyes see ancient flames dancing over dark waves. 40,000 scrolls, according to Seneca, or perhaps 700,000, as other historians whisper. The numbers are lost in the mist of time, but the pain remains crystalline. Each scroll that turned to ash carried centuries of human thought, poems that would never again be recited, scientific discoveries that would have to be rediscovered. But here is the first secret that popular history forgets. The great library did not die on that March day. Like an ancient tree wounded by lightning, it continued living, adapting, sending new shoots through its daughters scattered throughout the city. What Caesar destroyed was only a part, significant, painful, but not fatal. The true death would come later, more slowly, through 1,000 small cuts across centuries. I sit on the ancient stones and let the night breeze carry my mind back to those turbulent days. I can almost hear the sound of scrolls unrolling in flames, the cry of scholars running to save what they could, the terrible silence that followed when the last sparks died in the sea. This was only the first of many tragedies that would befall. The harbor waters shimmer black as obsidian in the pre-dawn darkness of March 48 BCE. I stand where Caesar's trireme once anchored, feeling the phantom weight of history pressing against my chest like a physical force. The Egyptian fleet surrounds him, dozens of sleek vessels, cutting through the water like predatory fish, their bronze rams gleaming in torchlight. This is not how the great general planned to enter Alexandria, but war rarely follows the scripts we write for it. Caesar's breath forms small clouds in the cool morning air as he surveys his impossible situation. Behind him lies the open Mediterranean, offering retreat but also disgrace. Before him stretches the most magnificent harbor in the ancient world, but it bristles with enemy ships commanded by the young Ptolemy XIII's admirals. The boy king has chosen Pompey's side in this civil war, and now Caesar finds himself trapped like a wolf surrounded by hunters. I can almost hear the creak of rope and timber as Caesar's ships rock gently in the swells. His soldiers, veterans of Gaul, men who have followed him across rivers and through forests, now find themselves in an alien element. These are not the rolling hills of France or the familiar roads of Italy. This is Egypt, land of mysteries and ancient wisdom, where the very air seems thick with the weight of millennia. The decision comes suddenly, as military decisions often do. Caesar's voice cuts through the morning stillness. Fire the ships. Not his own ships, that would be suicide. The Egyptian vessels blocking the harbor mouth, the merchant ships crowding the wharves, anything that floats and might be used against him. It is a desperate gambit, born of desperation and the kind of tactical brilliance that has made Caesar's name legendary from Britain to the Euphrates. The first torch arcs through the air like a falling star, landing on the deck of an Egyptian galley, then another and another. Within minutes, the harbor transforms into a scene from the underworld. Flames leap from ship to ship, carried by wind and the natural oils that waterproof the hulls. The fire spreads faster than anyone anticipated, faster than Caesar intended, faster than human control can contain. I watch the phantom flames dance across the water, and I understand the terrible mathematics of unintended consequences. Each burning ship becomes a torch itself, drifting with tide and current toward the shore. The wooden wharves catch fire first, ancient timber seasoned by decades of Mediterranean sun, dry as kindling. Then the warehouses, those massive stone and wood structures that line Alexandria's commercial district. The scribes working in the nearby library buildings smell smoke before they see flames. They emerge from their copying chambers, squinting in the growing light, scrolls still clutched in their ink-stained fingers. At first, it seems distant, a harbor fire, unfortunate but not uncommon in a busy port. But the wind is wrong, blowing inland instead of out to sea, carrying sparks and burning debris toward the heart of the city. Marcus Tullius, a Roman scholar studying Aristotelian texts, later writes to his brother, "The fire came like a living thing, hungry and without reason. We saved what we could, but the flames moved faster than our feet." His letter, preserved in a villa outside Rome, gives us one of the few eyewitness accounts of that terrible morning. The great library's main collection, housed in the museum complex within the royal quarter, sits too far inland to be immediately threatened. But the harbor district contains something almost as precious: the overflow collections, the duplicate scrolls, the working copies that scholars use for daily research. These burn first, sending columns of black smoke into the Egyptian sky. I can hear the phantom sounds of that morning, the roar of flames consuming wood and papyrus, the shouts of men trying to organize bucket brigades, the crash of burning timbers falling into the harbor. But underneath it all, a more subtle sound, the whisper of knowledge disappearing forever. each scroll that burns taking with it some fragment of human understanding that will never be recovered. Caesar himself watches from his ship, and I imagine the expression on his weathered face. This is not the first time his military actions have had unintended consequences, but perhaps it is the first time he has felt the weight of destroying something irreplaceable. He is a man who appreciates learning, who has written his own commentaries on his campaigns, who understands the value of preserved knowledge. The irony cuts deep. Caesar, who will later reform the Roman calendar based on Alexandrian astronomical knowledge, has just dealt the first serious blow to the institution that houses that very knowledge. The man who will become one of history's most famous writers has just burned an unknown number of books that will never be read again. As the sun rises higher, the full scope of the damage becomes clear. The harbor district smolders like a funeral pyre, sending acrid smoke across the city. Scholars and citizens alike stand in stunned silence, watching centuries of accumulated wisdom drift away as ash on the morning breeze. This is not the dramatic, total destruction that popular imagination often conjures. It is something more subtle and perhaps more tragic, the first of many wounds that will slowly bleed the great library to death. The water laps gently against the ancient stones where I stand, and I realize that this moment, this accidental burning, represents something profound about the fragility of human knowledge. It takes centuries to accumulate wisdom, but only hours to destroy it. Caesar's fire was not the end of the library of Alexandria, but it was the beginning of the end, the first crack in a foundation that would eventually crumble under the weight of time and human folly. The morning after Caesar's fire, Alexandria awakens to a changed world. I walk through the smoldering ruins of the harbor district, my sandals crunching on fragments of charred papyrus that flutter like black snow in the Mediterranean breeze. The acrid smell of burned knowledge hangs heavy in the air, mixing with the salt spray and the lingering smoke from timber that still glows red in the rubble. Demetrius, the scribe, emerges from his small dwelling near the docks, his face streaked with soot and tears. In his arms he cradles a single scroll, a copy of Euclid's geometric proofs that he managed to save from the flames. His workshop, where he spent 30 years copying manuscripts for scholars across the Mediterranean, is now nothing but blackened stone and twisted metal. The tools of his trade, his reed pens, his carefully mixed inks, his precious supply of papyrus, all reduced to ash. I follow Demetrius as he makes his way through the devastated streets, stepping carefully around fallen beams and pools of water where the bucket brigades fought their losing battle against the flames. Other survivors move like ghosts through the ruins, each carrying some small treasure they managed to rescue. A mathematical treatise, a collection of poems, a treatise on medicine. These fragments represent all that remains of collections that took generations to assemble. The great library's main building in the museum complex stands untouched, its marble columns gleaming white in the morning sun. But the scholars who gather in its courtyards speak in hushed tones, their faces grave with the understanding that something irreplaceable has been lost. Apollodorus, the head librarian, moves among them like a physician tending to the wounded, offering what comfort he can, while privately calculating the extent of the damage. "How many scrolls?" asks Sojournes, the astronomer who will later help Caesar reform the Roman calendar. His voice carries the weight of a man who understands that some knowledge, once lost, can never be recovered. Apollodorus shakes his head slowly. We may never know the true number. The harbor collections were not fully catalogued. Some estimate 40,000 scrolls, others say more. I sit in the shade of a palm tree in the museum's garden and imagine the conversations that must have taken place in those first days after the fire. Scholars debating whether to attempt reconstructions from memory, scribes volunteering to work without pay to replace what they could, wealthy patrons offering to fund new copying projects. The spirit of Alexandria, that unique blend of intellectual curiosity and practical determination, begins to assert itself even in the face of catastrophe. But there are losses that cannot be quantified or replaced. The personal notes of Archimedes, copied by a scholar who studied in Syracuse and brought to Alexandria for safekeeping. The only complete copy of Sappho's poems, preserved in the harbor district because a merchant's daughter loved to read them by the sea. The detailed observations of Babylonian astronomers, translated into Greek and stored in the commercial quarter because they were considered too practical for the main library. Young Hypatia's grandfather, a mathematician named Theon the Elder, walks through the ruins with his students, pointing out what can be learned even from destruction. See how the fire moved, he tells them, his voice steady despite the grief in his eyes. It followed the wind patterns, consumed the driest materials first, left the stone foundations intact. Even in catastrophe, there are lessons for those who observe carefully. The psychological impact ripples through Alexandria's intellectual community like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Scholars who once felt secure in their pursuit of knowledge now understand its fragility. The great project of the Ptolemies to gather all human knowledge in one place suddenly seems not just ambitious, but dangerous. What if all the world's wisdom could be destroyed in a single morning? Letters begin to flow out of Alexandria to libraries in Rhodes, Pergamum, and Athens. Scholars write urgently to colleagues, asking for copies of texts that might have been lost, offering to trade duplicates, proposing collaborative projects to preserve knowledge in multiple locations. The fire has taught them a lesson that will echo through the centuries. Knowledge is safest when it is shared, not hoarded. The evening light slants through the smoke that still rises from the harbor district, casting long shadows across the city. I realize that this moment represents something profound about human nature. Our capacity to create and preserve knowledge is matched only by our ability to accidentally destroy it. Caesar's fire was not malicious. It was the unintended consequence of military necessity. But its impact will be felt for centuries. As night falls over Alexandria, the scholars and scribes continue their work by lamplight. They copy, they catalog, they plan for the future. The great library has suffered its first mortal wound, but it is not yet dead. Like a great tree that continues to grow even after losing major branches, it will adapt, survive, and even flourish again. But it will never be quite the same, and the knowledge lost in Caesar's fire will remain forever beyond recovery. A reminder of how quickly the accumulated wisdom of centuries can vanish in smoke and flame.
3 decades have passed since Caesar's flames licked the harbor district, and Alexandria has learned to breathe again. I walk through the rebuilt streets where new libraries have sprouted like flowers after rain, each one a testament to the city's refusal to let knowledge die. The great Serapeum rises before me, its massive columns supporting not just a temple roof, but the weight of human hope itself. The daughter library, housed within the Serapeum, has become something remarkable. Not merely a replacement for what was lost, but an evolution. Where the original Great Library was a royal collection, accessible mainly to court scholars and visiting dignitaries, this new sanctuary of learning opens its doors more widely. Merchants' sons study alongside priests' daughters, and the sound of diverse voices reading aloud creates a symphony of languages that would have amazed the Ptolemies. I climb the marble steps worn smooth by countless sandaled feet and enter the main reading hall. The afternoon light streams through high windows, illuminating dust motes that dance like tiny spirits above the reading tables. Here, a young physician from Nubia copies medical texts while consulting with an elderly Greek doctor about the treatment of fevers. There, a Roman engineer sketches architectural plans while referencing scrolls on mathematics and engineering principles. Apollodorus the Younger, grandson of the librarian who witnessed Caesar's fire, moves between the tables with the quiet authority of someone born to this work. His grandfather's stories have shaped his understanding of knowledge as something precious and fragile, requiring constant vigilance to preserve. Under his guidance, the Serapeum has implemented new practices, multiple copies of important texts stored in different locations, regular inventories, and careful climate control to protect papyrus from Alexandria's humid air. The collection here tells the story of recovery and adaptation. Many scrolls bear the notation reconstructed from memory or compiled from fragments, testament to the painstaking work of scholars who refused to let Caesar's fire represent the final word. I unroll a copy of Euclid's Elements and notice the careful handwriting of 3 different scribes, evidence of the collaborative effort required to rebuild mathematical knowledge from scattered sources. But the Serapeum houses more than just replacements for lost texts. New works flow in constantly. Treatises on medicine from Indian scholars, astronomical observations from Babylonian priests, philosophical dialogues from Athens, and engineering manuals from Rome. The fire that seemed like an ending has somehow catalyzed a new beginning, drawing knowledge to Alexandria like iron filings to a magnet.
In a quiet alcove, I discover Theon of Alexandria, not the elder who witnessed the fire, but his descendant, a mathematician whose daughter will one day become the famous Hypatia. He works on a commentary to Ptolemy's Algemist, his reed pen scratching steadily across papyrus as he explains complex astronomical calculations in language that students can understand. His work represents the Serapeum's new mission, not just preserving knowledge, but making it accessible. The temple aspect of the Serapeum creates an atmosphere unlike the purely secular Great Library. Scholars pause in their work to offer incense to Serapis, the syncretic god who represents the fusion of Greek and Egyptian wisdom. This blending of religious reverence with intellectual pursuit gives the place a unique character. Knowledge is not just accumulated here, but consecrated. I watch a group of young students gathered around their teacher, a philosopher named Ammonius,
who has traveled from Athens to study Alexandrian methods of textual preservation. He explains how the fire taught scholars the importance of creating networks of knowledge rather than single repositories. A library, he tells them, is not a building or even a collection. It is a living system of minds connected by shared curiosity. The economic model of the Serapeum reflects this new understanding. Unlike the royal library, which depended entirely on Ptolemaic patronage, this institution draws support from multiple sources: wealthy merchants who profit from Alexandria's trade, Roman officials who recognize the value of preserved knowledge, even subscription fees from scholars who use the facilities. This diversified funding makes the library more resilient, but also more vulnerable to changing political winds. As evening approaches, I climb to the Serapeum's highest level, where astronomical instruments gleam in the fading light. From here, the view encompasses all of Alexandria: the rebuilt harbor district, the royal quarter with its empty palaces, the Jewish quarter with its own smaller libraries, the Christian district where a new kind of scholarship is beginning to emerge. The city has become a constellation of knowledge centers, each contributing to the whole. The irony is not lost on me. Caesar's destructive fire has led to a more distributed and perhaps more durable system of knowledge preservation. Where once Alexandria's intellectual life centered on a single great institution, now it flows through multiple channels. The Serapeum is the largest and most prestigious, but it is no longer alone in carrying the burden of preserving human wisdom. A cool breeze carries the scent of the sea, mixed with the familiar smell of papyrus and ink. Scribes work by lamplight in workshops throughout the city, their pens creating the steady rhythm that has become Alexandria's heartbeat. They copy not just for local use, but for libraries across the Mediterranean, understanding that knowledge shared is knowledge preserved. Yet even in this renaissance, shadows gather. The Roman Empire grows more centralized, drawing talent and resources toward Rome. Christianity spreads through Alexandria's streets, bringing new ideas about the relationship between faith and reason. Political tensions simmer between different communities, and the easy cosmopolitanism that once characterized the city shows signs of strain. Standing in the Serapeum as darkness falls, I realize that this daughter library represents both triumph and vulnerability. It has risen from the ashes of Caesar's fire, more beautiful and more accessible than its predecessor. But it also stands at the intersection of forces that will ultimately prove more destructive than any accidental blaze. The collision of religious certainty with intellectual inquiry, the tension between imperial power and local autonomy, the eternal human tendency to fear what we do not understand.
The year is 325 CE, and I feel the tremor of change rippling through Alexandria's ancient stones like an earthquake that moves not earth, but souls. Emperor Constantine has just concluded the Council of Nicaea, and the Christian wind that began as a whisper in the catacombs now roars through the empire with the force of imperial decree. I stand in the courtyard of the Serapeum, watching as the old world and the new circle each other like cautious dancers, neither yet ready to strike the fatal blow. The morning light catches the cross that now adorns the entrance to what was once purely a pagan temple. It sits uneasily beside the ancient symbols of Serapis, creating a visual tension that mirrors the intellectual struggle taking place within these walls. Christian scholars work alongside pagan philosophers, their conversations a delicate negotiation between faith and reason, revelation and investigation. Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria, walks through the library halls with measured steps, his dark robes rustling against marble floors worn smooth by centuries of scholarly feet. He is not here to destroy, not yet, but to understand what treasures of knowledge might serve the new Christian empire. His eyes, sharp with intelligence, scan the shelves with the calculating gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. I follow him as he pauses before a collection of Aristotelian texts, their papyrus yellowed with age, but their ideas still vibrant. A young Christian monk named Jerome, not yet the famous translator of the Bible, but already showing signs of his future brilliance, explains how these philosophical works might be reconciled with Christian doctrine. Truth is truth, Jerome argues, whether it comes from Athens or Jerusalem. But not all Christians share Jerome's accommodating view. In the shadows of the reading halls, I hear whispered conversations among the more zealous believers. They speak of pagan learning as a corruption, a temptation that leads souls away from the pure light of Christ. Their leader, a fiery preacher named Schnut, has begun gathering followers who see the library not as a treasure house, but as a den of demons. The pagan scholars sense the changing tide with the instinct of animals before a storm. Iamblichus, an elderly Neoplatonist who has spent 40 years studying in Alexandria, carefully packs his most precious scrolls for transport to Athens. He says to his students, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy, "The wind is shifting. What has been preserved here for 6 centuries may not survive the next 6 years."
Yet the transformation is not entirely destructive. Christian scholarship brings its own rigor and passion to the pursuit of knowledge. In a corner of the library, a group of theologians work on harmonizing the 4 Gospels. Their method as systematic as any mathematical proof. They create new forms of textual analysis, new ways of understanding the relationship between different sources of truth. I watch Origen's successor, a brilliant theologian named Didymus the Blind, as he teaches a mixed class of Christian and pagan students. Though he lost his sight in childhood, his mind navigates the labyrinth of ancient texts with unerring precision. He demonstrates how Platonic philosophy can illuminate Christian mysteries, how the tools of pagan learning can serve divine purposes. His students, Christian and pagan alike, listen with rapt attention, understanding that they are witnessing something unprecedented, the birth of a new kind of scholarship.
The library's collection begins to change, reflecting the new religious reality. Christian texts multiply, while pagan works are quietly moved to less accessible areas. New categories emerge, approved for Christian study, useful with caution, dangerous to faith. The old system of open inquiry gives way to a more structured approach that prioritizes orthodoxy over investigation. As night falls over Alexandria, I stand in the Serapeum's highest tower and watch the city transform below. Churches rise where temples once stood, their crosses gleaming in the moonlight like swords raised against the stars. The change is not yet complete. Pagan festivals still draw crowds. Philosophical schools still operate. The library still houses both Christian and pagan texts, but the direction is clear, and those with eyes to see understand that an age is ending. The Christian wind that now blows through Alexandria carries both destruction and renewal. It will sweep away much that is precious, but it will also preserve knowledge in new forms, create new institutions of learning, inspire new kinds of scholarship. The great library's second death is beginning, but from its ashes will rise something different, neither purely pagan nor purely Christian, but a hybrid that reflects the complex reality of a world in transition. The year is 400 CE, and I walk beside a remarkable woman through Alexandria's morning streets, her footsteps echoing with the confidence of someone who has never doubted her right to occupy space in a world of men. Hypatia of Alexandria moves like mathematics made flesh, precise, elegant, and utterly uncompromising in her pursuit of truth. At 45, she has become the most celebrated teacher in a city that has produced centuries of brilliant minds, yet she carries this distinction as naturally as she wears her philosopher's cloak. Her students gather in the portico of the museum, a diverse assembly that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Romans sit beside Egyptians, Christians next to pagans, wealthy merchant sons alongside poor but brilliant young men who have walked hundreds of miles for the privilege of studying under her guidance. She teaches them not just mathematics and astronomy, but something more precious, the art of thinking clearly in an age of increasing confusion. "Observe," Hypatia says, holding up an astrolabe whose bronze surface catches the morning light. "This instrument allows us to map the heavens, to predict eclipses, to navigate by the stars. But notice it works equally well whether you believe the gods control the celestial spheres or whether you follow the Christian teaching that God set the planets in motion. Truth transcends our beliefs about truth." I watch her students' faces as they absorb this lesson. Some nod eagerly, understanding immediately the profound implications of what she has said. Others look troubled, sensing the dangerous territory she has entered. In an age when religious orthodoxy increasingly demands intellectual conformity, Hypatia's insistence on the independence of rational inquiry makes her both invaluable and vulnerable. Her private study, tucked away in a corner of the museum complex, reveals the breadth of her interests. Scrolls on mathematics lie beside treatises on philosophy. Astronomical charts share space with mechanical drawings, and everywhere the evidence of her own original work. Commentaries on Apollonius's conic sections, improvements to the design of the astrolabe, philosophical meditations on the nature of infinity. The political situation in Alexandria grows more precarious with each passing year. Bishop Theophilus, Athanasius's successor, has begun a systematic campaign against pagan institutions. The great temple of Dionysus has been converted to a church, the shrine of Mithra demolished entirely. Yet somehow, the Serapeum and its library continue to function, protected, perhaps, by the sheer usefulness of the knowledge they contain. Hypatia navigates this dangerous landscape with remarkable skill. She maintains friendships with prominent Christians while never compromising her philosophical principles. Her public lectures draw audiences that include both the Roman prefect Orestes and various Christian clergy, all of whom recognize her extraordinary intellect
even when they disagree with her conclusions. I observe her teaching a lesson on the geometry of planetary motion, using Ptolemy's epicycles to explain the apparent retrograde movement of Mars. Her explanation is so clear, so elegant in its mathematical precision, that even students who arrived skeptical find themselves drawn into the beauty of the demonstration. This is knowledge at its purest, divorced from politics, religion, or personal ambition, existing simply because it reveals something true about the structure of reality. But the shadows are lengthening. Theophilus's nephew, Cyril, has begun preaching more aggressively against pagan learning, calling it a corruption that leads souls away from salvation. His followers, mostly drawn from Alexandria's poorer districts, view the library and its scholars with increasing suspicion. They see wealth and privilege where Hypatia sees the pursuit of truth, foreign influence where she sees universal human curiosity. The tension comes to a head during a public debate about the nature of the soul. Hypatia, representing the Platonic tradition, argues that the soul's immortality can be demonstrated through reason. Cyril, speaking for Orthodox Christianity, insists that such matters can only be understood through divine revelation. The debate itself is civil, even respectful, but the crowds that gather afterward are less restrained. She bewitches men with her mathematics, I hear a Christian zealot mutter, as Hypatia's students escort her home through increasingly hostile streets. She turns them away from the true faith with her pagan sorcery. The accusation is absurd. Hypatia's influence comes from her intellect, not supernatural powers. But in an age of religious fervor, absurdity often carries more weight than truth.
Her final lecture, delivered on a warm March morning in 415, focuses on the mathematical concept of infinity. She demonstrates how parallel lines, though they never meet in our finite experience, must theoretically converge at infinity, a point that exists beyond human perception, but can be grasped through pure reason. The metaphor is apt. She stands at the convergence point of ancient wisdom and modern faith, visible to those with eyes to see, but incomprehensible to those who fear what they cannot control. As I watch her explain these concepts to her devoted students, I am struck by the tragic irony of her situation. She represents everything that made Alexandria great: intellectual curiosity, cultural synthesis, the fearless pursuit of truth wherever it might lead. Yet these very qualities, once celebrated, now mark her as dangerous in an age that increasingly values conformity over inquiry. The library around her continues its work, but the atmosphere has changed. Scribes copy fewer pagan texts, scholars speak more cautiously about controversial topics, and the easy interchange between different traditions of thought becomes increasingly strained. Hypatia herself seems to sense that her time is ending, though she continues teaching with undiminished passion. Her students will remember her not just for her mathematical brilliance or her philosophical insights, but for her embodiment of a dying ideal, the belief that human reason, properly applied, can illuminate the deepest mysteries of existence. In a world increasingly divided between competing certainties, she represented the radical proposition that truth might be more complex than any single tradition could contain. The evening light slants through the museum's columns as Hypatia concludes her day's teaching. Tomorrow she will rise early, as always, to continue her work on the commentary to Ptolemy's Almagest. She does not know that tomorrow will never come for her, that the forces gathering in Alexandria streets will soon silence forever one of history's most brilliant voices.
The great Serapeum stands like a marble mountain against the Egyptian sky, its columns reaching toward heaven as if trying to bridge the gap between human knowledge and divine mystery. I walk through its halls in the year 391 CE, feeling the weight of impending doom pressing down like the oppressive heat before a thunderstorm. The daughter library that rose from Caesar's ashes has flourished for 3 centuries, but now faces a threat more systematic and deliberate than any accidental fire. Emperor Theodosius I has issued his decree from Constantinople, and its words echo through the empire like the tolling of a funeral bell. All pagan temples must be destroyed, all pagan practices banned, all vestiges of the old religion swept away in the name of Christian orthodoxy. In Alexandria, Bishop Theophilus receives these orders with the fervor of a man who has long awaited divine permission to complete a holy war. I observe the morning rituals that have continued unchanged for generations. Priests of Serapis burn incense before the great statue of their god, that magnificent fusion of Greek Zeus and Egyptian Osiris, whose benevolent face has watched over scholars for centuries. In the library halls below, scribes continue their patient work of copying manuscripts, their reed pens scratching across papyrus in the rhythm that has become Alexandria's heartbeat. But the city's pulse is irregular now, skipping beats as tension mounts between the Christian majority and the pagan minority who still cling to the old ways. Theophilus has been methodical in his campaign, starting with smaller temples and working his way toward the greatest prize of all. The Serapeum represents more than just another pagan shrine. It is the symbol of Alexandria's intellectual independence, the last bastion of the classical world's approach to knowledge. The confrontation begins not with violence, but with bureaucracy. Christian officials arrive at the Serapeum with scrolls bearing imperial seals, demanding an inventory of all pagan religious objects that must be surrendered. The head priest, an elderly man named Olympius, who has served Serapis for 40 years, receives them with dignity, but refuses to comply. This temple has stood for 6 centuries, he tells them, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. It will not fall to mere paperwork. Word spreads through Alexandria's pagan community like wildfire. Scholars, priests, and ordinary citizens who still honor the old gods begin gathering at the Serapeum, not to fight, but to bear witness. They understand that something irreplaceable is about to be lost, and they want to stand with it in its final hour. Among them, I recognize faces from the library, mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, who have spent their lives in pursuit of truth. The Christian crowd that assembles outside is larger and more volatile. Led by Theophilus himself, they carry crosses and chant hymns, but their songs have an edge of violence that makes the morning air vibrate with menace. Many are recent converts, zealous in the way that only the newly convinced can be, eager to prove their faith by destroying what they once revered. Inside the Serapeum, The pagan defenders make their preparations. They are not warriors. Most have never held weapons more dangerous than styluses or astrolabes, but they organize themselves with the methodical precision that characterizes scholarly minds. Some work to hide the most precious manuscripts in secret chambers. Others prepare to defend the temple's entrances. Still others simply sit in meditation before the great statue of Serapis, seeking wisdom in what may be their final hours. The siege begins at dawn, on a day that will be remembered as one of the darkest in Alexandria's history. Theophilus, resplendent in his episcopal robes, stands before the Serapeum's main entrance and delivers an ultimatum: surrender the pagan objects and abandon the temple, or face the consequences of defying God's will. The response comes not in words, but in the sound of heavy doors closing, bronze bolts sliding into place with the finality of a tomb being sealed. What follows is not the glorious battle that epic poets might sing, but something more tragic and more human. The Christian mob, inflamed by Theophilus's rhetoric, begins hurling stones at the temple's windows. The pagans inside respond by dropping roof tiles and pieces of marble, more in desperation than with any hope of victory. The violence escalates slowly, almost reluctantly, as if both sides understand they are participating in something that will diminish them all. I watch from the library's highest tower as the confrontation reaches its climax. A group of Christian zealots manages to break through a side entrance, and suddenly the temple fills with the sound of running feet and shouting voices. The great statue of Serapis, that masterpiece of Hellenistic art that has inspired wonder for centuries, crashes to the marble floor with a sound like thunder, its bronze head rolling across stones stained with blood. The destruction of the statue breaks something in the pagan defenders' spirit. They had fought not for their lives, but for their god, and with Serapis fallen, their cause seems hopeless. Some flee through secret passages, others surrender and are roughly handled by the Christian crowd. A few choose to die beside their broken deity rather than witness the complete desecration of their sacred space.
But it is what happens next that truly breaks my heart. As the Christian mob pours through the temple, they discover the library chambers below. Here are the scrolls that survived Caesar's fire, the patient reconstructions of lost knowledge, the new works created by centuries of scholars. To the zealots, these represent not human achievement, but demonic temptation, pagan sorcery that must be purged from the earth. The burning begins systematically. Theophilus himself selects which texts to preserve, those that might serve Christian purposes, and which to destroy. Mathematical treatises are spared, as are some medical works and astronomical observations. But philosophy, literature, and anything that explicitly celebrates pagan gods feeds the flames that soon engulf the Serapeum's courtyards. I stand among the phantom figures of ancient scholars as they watch their life's work turn to ash. Some weep openly, others maintain the stoic composure that philosophy has taught them, but all understand that they are witnessing the end of an era. The easy synthesis of different traditions, the open inquiry that characterized Alexandrian scholarship, the belief that truth could be found through reason as well as revelation, all of this dies with the burning scrolls. As evening falls, the Serapeum stands empty and broken. Its marble walls blackened with smoke, its floors littered with fragments of destroyed statues and burned papyrus. The daughter library that rose from Caesar's accidental fire has fallen to Theodosius's deliberate decree. and with it dies something precious and irreplaceable in human civilization.
The imperial decree arrives in Alexandria on a morning when the Mediterranean wind carries the scent of jasmine and the promise of rain. I hold the phantom parchment in my hands, feeling the weight of words that will reshape not just a city, but the very nature of human knowledge. Emperor Theodosius I, writing from his palace in Constantinople, has chosen his language carefully. Let no one henceforth dare to sacrifice an innocent victim, or to worship his household gods in secret, or to honor his penates, or to kindle fires upon his altars, or to offer incense to his images, or to hang up garlands. Bishop Theophilus receives the decree in his private study, surrounded by Christian texts that represent the new order rising from the ashes of the old. His fingers trace the imperial seal as he reads, and I see in his eyes not just religious fervor, but something more complex: the satisfaction of a man who has waited decades for divine authority to align with imperial power. This is not merely about destroying pagan temples. It is about remaking the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. The machinery of destruction moves with bureaucratic precision. Lists are compiled of every pagan shrine in Alexandria, from the great Serapeum to tiny household altars tucked away in private courtyards. Christian officials, armed with imperial authority, begin their systematic visits. They arrive not as a mob, but as representatives of law, carrying scrolls and seals, demanding compliance with the new religious order. I follow one such delegation as they approach the home of Theon, Hypatia's father, whose private library contains one of Alexandria's finest collections of mathematical and astronomical texts. The lead official, a young man named Palladius, who converted to Christianity only 5 years earlier, speaks with the zeal of the recently convinced. The emperor has commanded that all pagan practices cease. This includes the veneration of pagan authors whose works lead souls away from Christ. Theon, now in his 70s, receives them with the dignity of a man who has spent his life in pursuit of truth. His response reveals the impossible position in which Alexandria's scholars find themselves. These are works of mathematics and astronomy, he says, gesturing toward shelves lined with scrolls. They contain no religious content, only observations of natural phenomena and logical proofs. But Palladius is unmoved. Ptolemy's Almagest assumes the pagan notion of eternal celestial spheres. Euclid's geometry was used in pagan temple construction. All knowledge not explicitly Christian is potentially corrupting.
The theological justification for this intellectual purge has been carefully constructed by Christian scholars who understand the power of systematic argument. They argue that pagan learning, however seemingly neutral, carries within it assumptions that contradict Christian truth. The very method of rational inquiry, they claim, encourages pride and self-reliance rather than humble submission to divine revelation. Yet the implementation of these policies reveals the contradictions inherent in the Christian position. Even as they condemn pagan learning, Christian scholars desperately need the knowledge it contains. Astronomical calculations are required for determining the date of Easter. Medical texts are essential for treating the sick. Mathematical principles are necessary for church construction. The result is a complex process of selection and adaptation that transforms rather than simply destroy the classical tradition. I observe this process in the scriptorium that Theophilus has established in a former pagan temple. Christian scribes work alongside converted pagan scholars, carefully copying selected texts while excising passages deemed dangerous to faith. A treatise on medicine loses its invocations to Asclepius, but retains its surgical procedures. An astronomical work is stripped of references to planetary gods, but preserves its mathematical calculations. The human cost of this transformation becomes clear as I walk through Alexandria's intellectual community. Scholars who refuse to convert face exile or worse. Those who submit to baptism often find their life's work dismissed as worthless or dangerous. The easy collaboration between different traditions that once characterized Alexandrian scholarship gives way to suspicion and fear. Marcus Aurelius Cassiodorus, a Roman administrator with philosophical training, writes to a friend in Rome, "The Christians speak of preserving what is useful while discarding what is harmful. But who decides what is useful? Yesterday's essential text becomes today's dangerous heresy based on the shifting interpretations of bishops who often lack the very learning they presume to judge." The economic impact of the imperial decree extends far beyond religious buildings. Alexandria's book trade, which has flourished for centuries, collapses almost overnight. Wealthy collectors, fearing persecution, sell their libraries at desperate prices, or simply burn them to avoid suspicion. The network of scribes, binders, and merchants who made Alexandria the Mediterranean center of book production finds their livelihood destroyed by imperial fiat.
Yet even in this climate of repression, knowledge finds ways to survive. Christian monasteries, ironically, become repositories for texts that would otherwise be destroyed. Monks who understand the value of classical learning quietly preserve works they officially condemn, creating hidden collections that will survive the coming dark centuries. The monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Desert becomes a particular haven, its remote location protecting manuscripts from the zealotry of urban bishops. The psychological transformation of Alexandria's intellectual culture proves as significant as the physical destruction of its libraries. The open inquiry that once characterized the city's approach to knowledge gives way to a more cautious, circumscribed form of scholarship. Questions that once seemed natural and necessary now appear dangerous and potentially heretical. The very act of thinking independently becomes suspect in an age that demands conformity to revealed truth. I stand in the ruins of the Mausion, where weeds now grow between marble columns that once echoed with philosophical debate. The building itself remains structurally sound, but its spirit has fled. The community of scholars who made this place alive has scattered to the winds, some to Constantinople, others to Athens, many simply disappearing into the anonymity of conversion or exile. As night falls over Alexandria, I realize that Theodosius's decree represents more than just the triumph of one religion over another. It marks the end of the classical world's fundamental assumption that truth could be discovered through human reason and observation. In its place rises a new paradigm that subordinates all knowledge to religious authority, all inquiry to doctrinal orthodoxy. The great library's third death is not a single dramatic event, but a slow strangulation, accomplished not by barbarian invaders, but by the empire's own officials acting in the name of divine will. The irony is profound. The same imperial system that once protected and patronized learning now systematically dismantles the institutions that preserved human knowledge for centuries.
The decades pass like sighs in the Mediterranean wind, and I walk through an Alexandria that grows quieter with each passing year. It is now 450 CE, and the great intellectual ferment that once made this city the wonder of the ancient world has settled into something more subdued, more careful, more afraid. The libraries that remain operate under the watchful eyes of Christian authorities, their collections carefully curated to exclude anything that might challenge orthodox belief. I enter what was once the great library's main reading hall, now converted into a Christian school where young men study theology and approved classical texts. The marble floors still gleam, the columns still soar toward painted ceilings, but the atmosphere has fundamentally changed. Where once scholars debated freely about the nature of reality, now students recite catechisms and memorize biblical passages. The transformation is complete, yet somehow hollow. Brother Augustine, not the famous saint, but a local monk who has taken charge of the remaining book collection, moves between the reading tables with the measured pace of someone who has learned to be cautious. His keys jangle softly as he unlocks cabinets containing the texts deemed safe for Christian study. Mathematics, basic astronomy, medical treatises, these survive because they serve practical purposes. But philosophy, literature, and anything that celebrates human reason over divine revelation has largely disappeared. The economic decline of Alexandria mirrors its intellectual decay. Without the constant flow of scholars from across the Mediterranean, the city's book trade has withered. The workshops where scribes once copied manuscripts for libraries from Spain to Syria now stand empty, their tools gathering dust. The network of intellectual exchange that made Alexandria wealthy has been severed, leaving the city dependent on grain shipments and whatever trade still flows through its increasingly silted harbor. I observe a typical day in this diminished Alexandria. A young Christian scholar named Cosmas, later to become famous as Cosmas Indicopleustus, works on a geographical treatise that attempts to reconcile biblical cosmology with observed reality. His struggle is emblematic of the age: how to maintain intellectual honesty while conforming to religious orthodoxy. His solution is to reject much of classical geography as pagan error, creating a worldview that is theologically correct but scientifically impoverished. The few remaining pagan scholars operate in an atmosphere of constant fear. They meet in private homes, speak in coded language, and carefully hide any texts that might be considered dangerous. I watch an elderly philosopher named Damascius as he teaches a small group of students in a basement room, his voice barely above a whisper as he explains Platonic metaphysics. These underground schools preserve fragments of the classical tradition, but they are shadows of the great institutions that once flourished openly. The physical decay of Alexandria's intellectual infrastructure accelerates as imperial attention shifts elsewhere. Constantinople draws the empire's best minds and resources, while Alexandria becomes increasingly provincial. The museum complex, once the crown jewel of Ptolemaic patronage, now houses Christian offices and storage rooms. Its famous gardens, where philosophers once walked and debated, have been converted into vegetable plots to feed the city's poor. Yet even in decline, Alexandria continues to produce remarkable individuals. John Philoponus, a Christian philosopher with deep knowledge of Aristotelian physics, works to reconcile classical natural philosophy with Christian theology. His commentaries on Aristotle will survive the coming dark centuries and eventually influence medieval Islamic and European thought. He represents the best of what Christian scholarship can achieve: rigorous, learned, and genuinely innovative. The library's collection continues to shrink through a process that is both systematic and haphazard. Some texts are deliberately destroyed as heretical, others simply decay from neglect. The humid Alexandria climate, always challenging for papyrus preservation, becomes deadly when combined with reduced maintenance and care. I watch scrolls crumble to dust in storage rooms where the roof leaks and no one bothers to repair the damage. The copying of manuscripts, once Alexandria's greatest industry, becomes increasingly selective and ideologically driven. Christian texts are reproduced in multiple copies and distributed throughout the empire, while classical works survive only if they serve Christian purposes. A medical treatise by Galen is preserved because it helps heal the sick, but a philosophical dialogue by Plato disappears because it encourages independent thinking. The social fabric of Alexandria's intellectual community unravels as different groups retreat into separate enclaves. Christians dominate the official institutions, Jews maintain their own schools and libraries, and the few remaining pagans huddle in secret societies. The cosmopolitan synthesis that once made Alexandria unique gives way to fragmentation and mutual suspicion.
I visit the harbor district, rebuilt after Caesar's fire, but now showing signs of new decay. The great lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, still stands but no longer receives proper maintenance. Its light grows dimmer each year, a fitting metaphor for the city's declining role as a beacon of learning. Ships still arrive, but they carry grain and trade goods rather than scholars and manuscripts. The educational system that once attracted students from across the known world has contracted to serve mainly local needs. The advanced mathematical and astronomical instruction that made Alexandria famous has been replaced by basic literacy training and religious education. Young men who might once have become great scholars now enter the priesthood or imperial bureaucracy, their intellectual potential channeled into narrower pursuits. As I walk through the city's quieter streets, I encounter the human faces of this decline. Former scribes now work as common laborers, their specialized skills no longer valued. Elderly scholars sit in taverns reminiscing about the great debates and discoveries of their youth. Children play in the ruins of temples that once housed magnificent libraries, unaware of the treasures that have been lost. The irony of Alexandria's situation becomes clear as evening falls over the city. The same Christian faith that destroyed much of the classical tradition also preserves fragments of it in monasteries and church schools. The same imperial system that once protected learning now restricts it, but still maintains enough to serve practical needs. The city that once sought to contain all human knowledge now carefully limits what its citizens are allowed to know. Standing on the steps of what was once the great library, I realized that this slow decay represents something more profound than the loss of books or buildings. It marks the end of a particular way of thinking about knowledge, as something to be pursued for its own sake, questioned freely, and shared openly. In its place has risen a more cautious, more controlled approach that subordinates all learning to higher authorities and predetermined truths. The great library's fourth death is not a dramatic burning, but a gradual suffocation, accomplished not by enemies, but by friends who love it too little to let it breathe freely.
The year is 641 CE, and I stand on Alexandria's ancient harbor as Arab ships appear on the horizon like dark birds against the morning sky. The city that has endured Roman conquest, Christian transformation, and centuries of slow decline now faces yet another change of masters. But the story that will be told about this moment, the tale of Caliph Omar ordering the destruction of Alexandria's remaining books, is one that exists more in imagination than in historical reality. General Amr ibn al-As leads the Arab forces that will soon control Egypt, and I observe him as he surveys Alexandria from the deck of his flagship. He is not the barbarian destroyer of later legend, but a sophisticated military commander who understands the value of the territories he conquers. His correspondence with Caliph Omar reveals a man concerned with administration, taxation, and maintaining the economic productivity of his new province, not with burning libraries that may no longer exist. The Alexandria that greets the Arab conquerors is a shadow of its former self. 2.5 centuries have passed since the destruction of the Serapeum, and the systematic decline of the city's intellectual institutions has continued unabated. The great library, in any meaningful sense, has been dead for generations. What remains are scattered collections in churches, monasteries, and private homes, fragments of a once great whole, carefully curated and heavily censored. I walk through the city with John the Grammarian, a Christian scholar who will later be credited with pleading for the library's preservation in a story that historians now recognize as fictional. The real John Philoponus died decades before the Arab conquest, but legend has transformed him into a tragic figure begging the Caliph to spare books that no longer existed in any centralized collection. The myth that will grow around this moment reveals more about later attitudes than contemporary realities. In the 13th century, the Christian writer Gregory Bar Hebraeus will record the famous story of Omar's supposed response to John's plea. If these books agree with the Quran, they are superfluous. If they disagree, they are heretical. Either way, they should be burned. But this tale appears 6 centuries after the supposed events, written by an author with clear anti-Islamic bias during the era of the Crusades. The actual Arab conquest of Alexandria proceeds with remarkable restraint. Amr ibn al-As, following standard Islamic practice, offers the city's inhabitants the choice between conversion, tribute, or resistance. Most choose tribute, becoming dhimmis, protected peoples who retain their religious practices in exchange for special taxes. The transition is surprisingly smooth, with many Alexandrians welcoming Arab rule as preferable to Byzantine oppression.
I observe the real interactions between Arab conquerors and Alexandrian scholars. The Arabs, far from being destroyers of learning, are eager to acquire the scientific and philosophical knowledge that Alexandria still possesses. They bring with them their own intellectual traditions, poetry, astronomy, mathematics, and show genuine interest in Greek texts
that might enhance their understanding of the world. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom that will soon be established in Baghdad, represents the true Arab attitude toward classical learning. Rather than destroying Greek texts, Islamic scholars will translate them into Arabic, preserve them through the coming dark centuries, and eventually transmit them back to medieval Europe. The Arabs become not the destroyers of classical civilization, but its preservers and transmitters. In Alexandria's remaining scriptoriums, I watch Christian and Muslim scribes beginning to work together. The Arabs need administrative documents translated, legal texts copied, and scientific works preserved. The Christians possess the linguistic skills and technical knowledge to provide these services. A new synthesis begins to emerge, different from the old Hellenistic fusion, but equally creative in its own way. The economic revival that follows the Arab conquest brings new life to Alexandria's intellectual community. Trade routes that had been disrupted by Byzantine-Persian wars reopen under Islamic rule. Merchants from India, Central Asia, and the Far East bring not just goods but ideas, creating the kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere that once made Alexandria great. Yet the myth of the library's destruction by Arab conquerors serves important psychological functions for later generations. For medieval Christians, it provides a convenient explanation for the loss of classical learning that actually occurred through their own religious zealotry. For modern Western historians, it reinforces stereotypes about Islamic civilization as inherently hostile to knowledge and progress. The real story is more complex and ultimately more hopeful. The scattered remains of Alexandria's great libraries do not disappear in 641 CE, but gradually transform into something new. Islamic scholars, working with Christian and Jewish colleagues, begin the great project of translation and preservation that will keep classical learning alive through the medieval period. I visit the house of a Coptic Christian named Severus, who possesses one of Alexandria's last significant private libraries. He shows me scrolls of Galen's medical works, Ptolemy's astronomical observations, and Euclid's mathematical proofs, texts that survived the Christian purges because of their practical value. Now he negotiates with Arab scholars who want to translate these works into Arabic, ensuring their preservation for future generations. The transformation of Alexandria under Islamic rule represents not an ending, but a beginning. The city that once served as the bridge between Greek and Roman civilizations now becomes the link between classical antiquity and the Islamic world. Knowledge flows not just from Greek into Arabic, but from Arabic into Greek, as Islamic innovations in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine enriched the surviving Christian scholarly community. As I stand in the harbor at sunset, watching Arab and Byzantine ships sharing the same waters, I realize that the story of the Great Library's destruction reveals as much about the storytellers as about the events they claim to describe. Each generation creates its own version of the library's fate, projecting its own fears and prejudices onto the past. The truth is both simpler and more complex than the dramatic tales suggest. The Great Library of Alexandria died not once, but many times, through accidental fire, deliberate destruction, systematic neglect, and gradual transformation. Its final death under Arab rule is largely mythical, a story created centuries later to serve the political and religious needs of its inventors. But perhaps the most important truth is that knowledge, like water, finds ways to survive even when its containers are broken. The wisdom preserved in Alexandria's libraries lived on in new forms, new languages,
and new institutions. The Arabs who conquered the city became not its destroyers, but its inheritors, carrying forward the intellectual legacy of the ancient world into a new age of discovery and learning.
I stand in the ruins of what was once the greatest repository of human knowledge, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down like the Egyptian sun at noon. The truth about the Library of Alexandria's destruction is not a single story, but a symphony of endings, each movement contributing to the final silence. As the morning mist rises from the Mediterranean, I see the phantom figures of all those who played their part in this long tragedy: Caesar with his desperate flames, Christian zealots with their righteous fury, neglectful administrators with their empty coffers, and time itself, the most patient destroyer of all. The archaeological evidence tells a story that popular imagination has consistently refused to accept. Excavations in modern Alexandria reveal no dramatic burn layers from the 7th century, no sudden destruction that would mark the mythical Arab burning. Instead, the physical record shows what historians have long suspected: a gradual abandonment, a slow decay, a civilization that died not with a bang, but with a whimper. Dr. Mustafa El-Abadi, the Egyptian historian who spent decades studying Alexandria's libraries, walks beside me through these phantom ruins. His research has revealed the uncomfortable truth that the Great Library was already a memory by the time the Arabs arrived. "We want our tragedies to be dramatic," he tells me, his voice carrying the weight of scholarly disappointment. "We want clear villains and innocent victims. But history is messier than our myths. The real story emerges from careful analysis of ancient sources, each piece of evidence adding to a picture that is both more complex and more tragic than the simple tales of destruction." Strabo, writing in the 1st century CE, already speaks of the library in past tense. Plutarch describes Caesar's fire as damaging the Great Library, but other sources suggest this referred to book warehouses near the harbor, not the main collection. The confusion of ancient testimony reflects the confusion of ancient reality. I examine the timeline that scholars have painstakingly reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. The first major blow comes with Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, significant but not fatal. The library continues, adapts, even flourishes under early Roman rule. Mark Antony's gift of 200,000 scrolls from Pergamon helps rebuild the collection, demonstrating that the institution remained viable and valued.
The Christian transformation of the 4th and 5th centuries represents the 3rd phase, not a sudden destruction, but a systematic reorientation of intellectual life. The Serapeum's destruction in 391 CE eliminates the daughter library, but by this time, the main collection has already been dispersed, sold, or allowed to decay. What the Christians destroy is not the great library of legend, but its scattered remnants. The final phase is the longest and perhaps the most tragic: the slow abandonment that characterizes late antiquity. Without imperial support, without a community of scholars to use and maintain them, the remaining collections simply fade away. Papyrus scrolls crumble in humid storage rooms, manuscripts are recycled for other purposes, and the institutional memory that once preserved knowledge across generations is lost. I walk through the phantom halls where this decline played out over centuries. Here, a room where scrolls were once carefully cataloged now stands empty, its shelves repurposed for storing grain. There, a scriptorium where scribes once copied precious texts has been converted into a Christian chapel. The transformation is complete, but gradual.
like watching a great tree die leaf by leaf. The human dimension of this loss becomes clear as I encounter the ghost of Theon of Alexandria, Hypatia's father, working alone in his private study as the great institutions crumble around him. He represents the last generation of scholars who remember what Alexandria once was, who understand what is being lost. His commentaries on Ptolemy and Euclid preserve fragments of the mathematical tradition, but he knows that the great synthesis of knowledge that once flourished here is ending. The irony of the library's fate is that it died not from the hatred of its enemies, but from the indifference of its friends. The Christians who inherited Alexandria were not uniformly hostile to learning. Many were themselves scholars who valued classical texts, but they lacked the institutional commitment and financial resources necessary to maintain the vast collections that the Ptolemies had assembled. The economic factors are crucial but often overlooked in popular accounts. The Great Library was not just a collection of books, but a complex institution requiring constant funding for acquisitions, copying, maintenance, and staff. The Ptolemaic kings had supported it as a matter of royal prestige, but their Roman successors had different priorities. Without sustained patronage, even the greatest library in the world could not survive.
The technological factors also played a role. The transition from papyrus scrolls to parchment codices, while ultimately beneficial for book preservation, created a period of instability. Old collections on papyrus were not automatically transferred to the new format, and many texts were lost during this transition. The library's death coincided with a broader transformation in how knowledge was stored and transmitted. As I stand in the place where the great library once flourished, I realize that its destruction teaches us something profound about the fragility of human achievement. Knowledge is not self-preserving. It requires constant care, continuous investment, and communities of people who value it enough to maintain it across generations. When any of these elements fails, even the greatest repositories of learning can vanish. The multiple deaths of the Library of Alexandria, by fire, by zealotry, by neglect, by transformation, reflect the multiple ways that civilizations can lose their accumulated wisdom. Each death teaches its own lesson: the danger of war, the cost of fanaticism, the price of indifference, the inevitability of change. Together they remind us that preservation of knowledge is not a passive act, but an active choice that each generation must make anew. The truth about Alexandria's libraries is both more mundane and more profound than the myths suggest. They died not because of any single villain's malice, but because of the accumulated weight of human frailty, our tendency toward violence, our susceptibility to fanaticism, our capacity for neglect, our inability to maintain institutions across the centuries. In understanding their death, we better understand our own responsibility to preserve what we have inherited and to pass it on to those who come after us.
The Mediterranean wind carries whispers of eternity as I stand where the great library once reached toward the heavens, its marble columns now existing only in the realm of memory and dream. The sun sets over Alexandria, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that echo the color of ancient papyrus, and I feel the weight of all the stories we have shared settling into the quiet spaces of the heart. What died in Alexandria was not merely a collection of scrolls or a building of stone and marble,
but something far more precious and fragile. The dream that all human knowledge could be gathered in one place, that wisdom could transcend the boundaries of culture and creed, that the accumulated learning of our species could be preserved for all time. This dream, born in the mind of Alexander and nurtured by the Ptolemies, flickered and faded over the centuries like a candle burning down to its final moments. The ghosts of ancient scholars walk beside me through these phantom halls, their voices growing softer as the evening deepens. Eratosthenes, who measured the circumference of the earth with nothing but shadows and geometry, whispers of the joy of discovery. Aristarchus, who dared to suggest that the earth revolves around the sun, speaks of the courage required to challenge accepted wisdom. Hypatia, brilliant and doomed, reminds us that knowledge without the freedom to pursue it is merely decoration for tyranny. Each scroll that burned, each manuscript that crumbled, each text that was deliberately destroyed carried within it not just information, but the dreams and struggles of human minds reaching toward understanding. The loss was not merely quantitative, so many thousands of works destroyed, but qualitative, representing the death of entire ways of thinking about the world and our place within it. Yet, as I walk through these ruins of memory, I begin to understand that the Library of Alexandria never truly died, because it never truly existed as the monolithic institution of popular imagination. It was always a living, changing, evolving organism, sometimes growing, sometimes shrinking, sometimes transforming into something new, always alive. The knowledge it contained flowed like water, finding new channels when old ones were blocked, seeping into unexpected places, emerging in forms that would have surprised its original guardians.
The Arabic translations that preserved Greek philosophy through the medieval period, the Byzantine manuscripts that carried classical texts to Renaissance Europe, the monastery libraries that secretly maintained pagan works alongside Christian ones. All of these represent the library's afterlife, its knowledge reborn in new forms and new languages. The dream of universal knowledge did not die with Alexandria's decline, but migrated to Baghdad's House of Wisdom, to Cordoba's libraries, to the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, and eventually to the printing presses that would democratize learning beyond anything the ancient world could have imagined. The real tragedy of Alexandria's libraries lies not in their destruction, but in what their fate reveals about human nature. We are creatures capable of creating magnificent institutions dedicated to preserving and expanding knowledge, yet we are also capable of destroying those same institutions through war, fanaticism, neglect, or simple indifference. The same species that produced Euclid and Eratosthenes also produced the zealots who burned the Serapeum and the administrators who allowed great collections to crumble through neglect. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above Alexandria, I reflect on the lessons that the library's multiple deaths teach us. Caesar's accidental fire reminds us that knowledge is vulnerable to the unintended consequences of human conflict. The Christian destruction of pagan texts warns us of the dangers of ideological purity that cannot tolerate alternative viewpoints. The slow decay of the imperial period shows us that knowledge requires not just creation, but constant maintenance and renewal. The mythical Arab burning shows us how we create stories to explain losses that are too complex or uncomfortable to face directly. But perhaps the most important lesson
is that knowledge, like life itself, is not a possession to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared. The Ptolemies' dream of gathering all wisdom in one place was noble, but ultimately flawed, because it assumed that knowledge could be contained and controlled. The real legacy of Alexandria lies not in any single institution, but in the principle it represented, that human curiosity and the pursuit of understanding are among our species' highest callings. The evening breeze carries the scent of jasmine and salt air, mixing the perfumes of land and sea in a fragrance that seems to embody Alexandria's eternal character as a place where different worlds meet and mingle. In this twilight hour, the boundary between past and present grows thin, and I can almost see the phantom figures of all those who contributed to the great work of preserving and transmitting human knowledge across the centuries.
They remind me that every library that exists today, every book that survives, every idea that continues to inspire and challenge us, represents a victory over the forces that destroyed Alexandria's collections. Each time we choose to preserve rather than destroy, to share rather than hoard, to question rather than accept blindly, we honor the memory of those ancient scholars who believed that knowledge was worth any sacrifice to obtain and preserve. The great library of Alexandria died many deaths, but its spirit lives on in every institution dedicated to learning, every scholar pursuing truth, every student discovering the joy of understanding. Its real treasure was never the scrolls themselves, but the human commitment to knowledge that created and sustained them. That commitment cannot be burned, cannot be banned, cannot be allowed to decay. It can only be renewed by each generation that chooses to value learning over ignorance, curiosity over certainty, wisdom over power. As the last light fades from the Egyptian sky, I understand that we are all inheritors of Alexandria's legacy, guardians of the flame that once burned so brightly in this ancient city. The library's destruction teaches us that knowledge is fragile, but its preservation across the centuries proves that the human spirit is stronger than any force that would extinguish the light of learning. The waves lap gently against the harbor stones, carrying their eternal rhythm that has outlasted empires and will outlast us all. In that sound, I hear the whisper of continuity, the promise that knowledge, like water, will always find a way to flow forward, carrying the dreams and discoveries of the past into the uncertain but hopeful future. Boa noite, viajante do tempo. Que seus sonhos carreguem ecos das vozes que hoje emprestamos, e que o amanhã encontre você descansado nas pegadas suaves que deixamos na areia infinita da história.
The phantom voices of Alexandria's scholars grow softer now, their whispers blending with the gentle rhythm of Mediterranean waves against ancient stones. I feel myself drifting between the world of waking thought and the deeper realm where knowledge becomes dream, where the boundaries between past and present dissolve like morning mist over the harbor. The great columns of memory sway gently in the evening breeze, their marble surfaces warm with the accumulated sunlight of centuries. Each stone holds within it the echo of footsteps, scholars hurrying to lectures, scribes carrying precious scrolls, students debating under starlit skies. These sounds fade now into something softer, more distant, like voices calling across vast expanses of time and water. In this twilight space between consciousness and sleep, the Library of Alexandria exists not as it was in any single moment of history, but as it always was in the realm of human aspiration, infinite, eternal, perfect in its impossible dream of containing all knowledge. Here, no fires burn except the gentle flames of curiosity. No zealots destroy except to make room for new understanding. No time passes except the peaceful rhythm of learning and discovery. The scrolls unfurl themselves in slow motion, their papyrus surfaces catching moonlight like sails filled with the wind of wonder. Words flow like water, carrying the accumulated wisdom of ages into the quiet pools of consciousness where dreams are born. Mathematics becomes music, astronomy transforms into poetry, philosophy dissolves into the deeper knowing that comes only in sleep. Let the gentle current of these ancient voices carry you now toward rest, toward the place where all knowledge converges in the simple act of breathing, of being, of allowing the mind to release its grip on the day's concerns and drift into the timeless realm where Alexandria's true library still stands, eternal and indestructible, waiting for all who seek wisdom in the country of dreams. Sleep now, keeper of knowledge. The library lives on in you.